Hi everyone. I'm just getting used to this microphone. I have a Britney Madonna setup today, but I hope you can all hear me fine. Yeah. We're just going to get the camera set up. Thank you to David for this invitation. It's very nice to come back and be part of this ongoing series of events. And yeah, maybe whilst Nicolas gets ready, this is the title of the talk today. I think in England we have this expression, biting off more than you can chew, which is when you sort of take on something that you can't actually handle yourself. And I think I might have done that today. And the title reflects this. It's quite a heavy title. So I hope, if nothing else, to try and make it a bit light as we go along, or as light as possible. But it's called Recovering the Outside, or the Possible Impossible. So, yeah, Nicolas, are we ready to start? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to sit down and... Yeah, so as David said, I'm responding to the PhD, but also just responding to his performance practice and some ideas, recurring ideas around theatre and ecology, ideas around the agency of the spectator, and perhaps a bit more specifically this question that David asks in his PhD: how is the isolated place of theatre challenged by the Anthropocene? The Anthropocene, I don't know if everyone's familiar with the term, but it's the age of humans, it's the age of human impact on the planet, the age of profound planetary uncertainty, the age of extinction of species. It is the age of never-befores. That's how the news often frames it. Never before has such and such happened. Never before are we in this situation. It's also the age in which we can no longer confidently say about, for example, a flood or a hurricane, that it is a natural catastrophe. And in a nutshell, the European conception of what was once nature, that outside of culture, that majestic, seasonal, cyclical, stable, and maybe sublime world, it's now so enmeshed. It's so enmeshed with human industry. Nature is so enmeshed with extraction, production, pollution, that the boundaries that once seemed to delimit these worlds, nature and culture, they are dissolving today. In a nutshell, extreme weather and extreme capitalism are one and the same thing. In the Anthropocene, the age of humans, the European conception of what it means to inhabit a body in space and time is no longer guaranteed. And in some respects, perhaps this is a good thing. As decolonial theory shows, many aspects of European philosophy underlay and support colonization and expropriation of land and people that are exemplary of the Anthropocene. My focus today is theatre, the theatre as a container, as a space, the theatre as an apparatus, an institution, a set of aesthetics, a theatre that was established at another time. And like David, I have been very interested to ask creatively and critically how the theatre is transformed by and in the present epoch. How is the theatre transformed in the Anthropocene? Not so much in the sense of simply changing the content of theatre, what we put inside it, but more in the sense of rethinking the space. How is it activated or deactivated, perhaps? To ask, as the avant-garde movements have often done, what is this art form, really? what is human performance today at a time when the agency of human industry is making worlds disappear? What histories do we draw on to rethink what theatre can be, must be? For the talk, I will be sort of circling around this 2011 piece by David, Tonight, Lights Out. This is a piece that I believe has been shown around maybe 50 times around Europe. We are in a bare theatre with many light bulbs hanging from the ceiling. And in the piece, David begins by telling two stories to the audience. One story is a kind of a modern-day fable in a polluted part of Cairo. And the story involves a young Egyptian boy who is visited, we could say, by a god and told in a dream to perform a ritual of turning off all the lights and sitting in the darkness for a while. And through this action, what happens rather magically is that the polluted black air of that part of Cairo is lifted. So that's one story. And then the other story that David tells at the beginning of Tonight Lights Out is about a 2007 campaign by a German newspaper asking people to switch off the lights for the planet. Switch off the lights for 5 minutes on a particular day at a particular time to raise awareness of climate change. So these are the two stories that open the piece Tonight Lights Out. And then after the stories, what happens is the audience members are made aware that each has a light control under their chair, a light control, and that each controls one of the light bulbs hanging in the space. It's unclear which, maybe at first. And the idea is to see if the audience can collectively agree to establish and sit in darkness. So by turning off your own light bulb, we can, as an audience, perhaps arrive at a moment of collective darkness. It's a pitch black darkness where you cannot see your own hand in front of you, so sort of total darkness. And I've read that there are times in presenting this piece where there is a sort of tense negotiation in the audience to reach this state of darkness, because of course it requires a kind of total consensus. If you just have one light bulb on, there is no darkness, of course. And so often the darkness is disturbed or disallowed by people who don't want to enter the darkness and don't want to accept the terms of the game. So there is a distinct chance of things going wrong in this performance, and indeed that might be what's at stake, the going wrong. People leave the theatre, and if or when the darkness is achieved, it may only last, or at least so I read, for a fraction of a second, or maybe half an hour. So I want to quote David now. I'm curious, what is it that's achieved? What is this darkness like? What is it like to sit in this darkness? And here I'm quoting from David's work. He writes that the darkness is like being in a grave with your eyes wide open. And then he continues, when the audience is plunged into this darkness together, it is absolutely unsettling. They lose track of where they are and what they are doing there. But it is also the moment in which finally, simultaneously, they become fully a community. So really I'm going to talk about three things. The first is this darkness. I want to stay with this darkness for a while. And I want to do so by referencing some other works. I'm thinking in particular of the darkness, not of the theatre, but of the cinema. Of course, the two are very strongly related. But I'm thinking really of cinema and films. And for some reason, I'm often drawn to other art forms, like cinema, when seeking to understand performance. It's as though I'm trying to understand live performance through negative means, through what it isn't, rather than what it is. So first of all, I would like to think of Alice Rohrwacher, the Italian filmmaker, and her recent film, La Chimera, which is a lot about darkness. It's a lot about darkness. It's a film about these tombs, these Etruscan tombs that are very prevalent all around Tuscany in Italy. Etruscan civilization predating the Roman civilization. And in the film, we have these grave diggers set in the 1980s, and the grave diggers find these tombs and steal or take the statues and objects inside the tombs, meant for, of course, the dead, to accompany the dead into the afterlife. There is this refrain that happens in the film, which is about things that are not meant for human eyes. The tombs, the Etruscan tombs, contain things that are not meant for human eyes. The tombs are, of course, sacred spaces, and they are to remain in darkness. That's the idea. And in interviews, Alice Rohrwacher, the director, speaks of this time around the 1980s, in Italy at least, when it becomes acceptable, it's still illegal, but it becomes acceptable to mine these tombs. It becomes acceptable to extract the statues and the other sort of sacred objects and to sell these on the black market. All of which is to say that at some point in history, in the 1980s perhaps, this darkness is radically interrupted. And so light enters these ancient tombs for the first time. Something is breached, something is broken into. And there is an amazing scene in the film where a rare tomb is discovered by the grave diggers, and they open it, and we hear the frescoes on the walls harden. There's a sort of sound, like a kind of, and we sort of see the frescoes on the wall lose their color as they come into contact with air for the first time in several thousands of years. This is an act of predation. That's how it's framed. It's an act of predation, and it's our predation because, of course, the gravedigger's transgression is not theirs, but it's symptomatic of a shift in culture. I think our predation speaks of betrayal of the dead Etruscans who were entrusted to the other world through the simple means of darkness underground. Of course, we could say, well, they're not really going to another world. They're not really going to another world. It's a sort of magic trick. They just go in the ground, right? They're not really traveling to the afterlife. They're just in the darkness underground. But of course, as long as we maintain that space hidden and dark, as long as we continue our promise to the dead, then effectively we are delivering them to another world. We are, and this is in an echo of a different piece by David, we are the guardians of the sleep of the dead, and as the film shows, we have failed them miserably. Last couple of thoughts in relation to this film. So the timescale of the darkness in La Chimera is much longer than the darkness in Tonight Lights Out. In La Chimera, the darkness lasts thousands of years. In Tonight Lights Out, the darkness lasts, maybe a second, or 10 minutes, or half an hour. But it makes me think of how, as a culture, how we decide to sustain spaces of darkness. Where are the spaces of darkness in our culture? How do we negotiate to maintain these spaces unvisited, unexplored, and therefore unexploited? How do we all agree, okay, everyone, we're not opening this cave. It's not a commodity. It must remain shut. And why is it that in the history of capitalism in the 1980s something broke and we could now conceive of breaching the vital darkness for the sake of profit? Predation has become business as usual. If we go back to David's statement about community, that in this performance, the sense of community is only really achieved once the darkness is reached, however briefly, I now understand it differently in relation to Rohrwacher's films about those who break the darkness. It's as if as a society, we can only really call ourselves a community when we manage to maintain these dark spaces. It's a very difficult undertaking. It's close to impossible. Maybe it is impossible, but at any rate, it's far from guaranteed. And yet, it's rehearsable. We can rehearse it. We can do it. We can achieve it. And certainly in the contained space of the theatre, we can try that. There is here an ethics. It's an ethics of darkness, connecting the living and the dead, the past and the present. It is as urgent a task as any other, and it's a deeply ecological one. I want to stay with this darkness a bit longer, darkness and cinema, and mention Il Buco, The Hole, by Michelangelo Frammartino, different Italian filmmaker. I'm not choosing these films on the basis that they're Italian, but somehow it's just happened, I guess. There seems to be something happening in Italy at the moment with mixing ecology and magic and fables and landscapes. Michelangelo Frammartino, very famous from Le Quattro Volte from 2011, and this is his more recent film, Il Buco. Much of the film happens underground. We're inside a 700-meter deep abyss or cave in Calabria, in the south of Italy, and the only light in these scenes is the light of the speleologists on their helmets. And what's interesting about this film, about the darkness of this film, is that the darkness that, if you like, we see on the screen, if you're watching it in the cinema at least, becomes indistinguishable from the darkness inside the enclosed cinema. In fact, it's the same material that we're immersed in, and the beam of the cinema projector, the beam of light of the cinema projector mirrors the beam of light of the speleologists in the cave. There is also a kind of mystical or fable-like connection in the film. I won't spoil it, but between the speleologists making their way underground, gradually mapping the entire cave, and an old farmer, an old Calabrian farmer living overground, who becomes progressively more and more ill. So there is this mapping and charting of the dark abyss at the same time as a man begins to die. And in Frammartino's film, the connection between the speleologist's slow underground conquest and the old farmer dying is never made explicit. It's like a sort of magical connection, somewhat impossible, and yet that's exactly what happens through us and inside us as we watch the film. We could say that poetically we experience how the conquering of dark space, the illuminating for the first time of this dark space causes the death of a local farmer, traditionally a keeper of the land. Oh yeah, here's another image. And here's another image. And last but not least, in terms of cinematic darkness, I want to read a passage from The Hatred of Poetry by the US novelist and poet Ben Lerner. This is from maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, but it's really a book about trying to find and define poetry through a kind of absence. poems fail to really do poetry, and in that failure, that's how we get to experience poetry. It's an interesting, very funny argument. But I want to read a particular passage. Ben Lerner is recounting being a teenager, and he's at a summer camp called Nature Day Camp. No, sorry, Back to Nature Day Camp in the US. And there is a heat wave. And he says the confused teenage counselor, in order to keep all the kids from getting sunstroke, they take the kids to the cinema every day, 5 days in a row. And now I begin reading. He writes, I remember Planet of the Apes. All the younger campers wept with terror. I want to note only that each time the house lights dimmed in the theater, I felt that other worlds were possible. I felt all my senses had been reset and sharpened, that some of them were melding with those of the other kids with their giant cokes in the dark beside me. He writes, this faded quickly as the film progressed and the image of a particular alternative world appeared before us on the screen. There was no trace of it by the time we were released into the natural bright day. But each time the lights went down and the first preview lit up the screen, I felt overwhelmed by an abstract capacity I associate with poetry. Not the artwork itself, even when the artwork is great, but the little clearing the theater makes. Not the artwork itself, even when the artwork is great, but the little clearing the theater makes. And the way I sort of read this is it's not so much about the maybe fairly, to theatre people, I know there's a fairly obvious idea of expectation when the lights in a theatre or a cinema go down, and we have this sense of expectation. Ooh, what's about to happen? But rather, what I get from Ben Lerner's story there is that this moment of potential, of something, anything about to happen, this moment in which the senses are sharpened, and you feel your body connecting to the other bodies in the room. All of this is the experience that Ben Lerner is savoring. And it's a modality of experience that I think is linked to the impossible in some way. It's impossible, but it's also unfolding. It's also happening here and now. That's what I think, gesturing. Across those 5 days of a heat wave at his Back to Nature camp, Ben Lerner repeatedly experiences a kind of semi-religious epiphany. And as he explains, it's not about the artwork, whatever film he then watched. It's about the clearing the theatre makes. And I think that this clearing, I think of it as a sort of recovering of the outside, a kind of recovering of the outside that you can only practice in an enclosed space. And although Ben Lerner positions this experience, this kind of epiphanic experience, at the borders of the artwork, or before the artwork, we can wonder, of course, whether it could become the artwork, whether the act of clearing of the theatre might be a way of describing the experience of tonight, lights out. Lastly, from Ben Lerner, elsewhere in the book, he talks about poetry for the way it makes a clearing, but without the ability to really present the thing that it is clearing for. He writes, poetry becomes a word for an outside that poems cannot bring about, but can make felt, albeit as an absence. The poem fails, but as it fails, it gestures to poetry. But hold on a second, what's all this talk of the impossible and mysticism and magic? what the hell? What are you saying? Are you suggesting that these works in some way, film works, these performance works, allude to a space beyond some great other? Surely performance is about being here, in the present, flesh and blood, here and now, not some mystery elsewhere. But I guess this would be my point, if I have a point, which is that through performance, the here yields to an elsewhere. That the enclosed space of the theatre is this apparent contradiction, a container for going outside. It's not a spiritual ascent. I see it more like a kind of falling as the ground beneath our feet gives way. I see it as a kind of groundlessness. There's groundlessness and there's withholding. Those are the last 2 points. I think we're more than halfway through. So we're doing quite well. So I'd like to talk a little bit about this groundlessness. What is it like to experience the darkness, a dark enclosure? What might it be like to negotiate with a crowd of people towards darkness? Maybe to not manage, maybe to fail. What is it like to succeed? Is it even a success? Is the moment of darkness a result, like reaching a goal? Or is it actually when other troubles begin? I don't know, because I've never actually experienced the work. I've never been a spectator to David's performances, so all I have is my experience of reading. But I can imagine, as a performance moment, it's one that highlights what we might call groundlessness, which is something I associate with performance, especially ecological performance. So to talk about performance for a moment, I don't think there are any hard definitions of live performance, only different ways of being invested in it, let's say. And my investment in performance, I think, relates to the idea that performance is what happens and what can only happen with the presence of an audience. It's the coming together of usually prepared actions of some sort and a viewer, a listener, or a witness. That is what constitutes the performance event. Of course, this might be true of other theatre activities. You know, if no one goes to a musical, surely the musical doesn't happen. But performance is this sort of hybrid form existing since the 1960s, somewhere between art and academia, which insists on and explores this relational dynamic, this being here-ness. I would say performance is an art form about how we inhabit time, alone or collectively. It's also an art form about how our consciousness is processing this very moment of performance. It's about how we experience. And because of this focus on present experience in performance studies, often in theatre, some types of theatre, there is a tendency to reinforce a sense of groundedness, a really solid sense of absolute embodiment or reality. I think of Marina Abramovich and the way she speaks of performance being radically real, unlike theatre being radically fake, for example. And of course there is a degree of truth to that, but I would like to stress that the way we inhabit time, the way we experience isn't grounded or singular or mapped. I take an idea here from the philosopher Simon Critchley, his recent book, Mysticism, where he's discussing the relationship between mind and body. And he's very critical of what he calls body holism, this sort of idea of understanding our relationship to the world as being completely rooted and embodied, as if we can touch some sort of ultimate real bodily reality. He suggests kind of something quite different. He writes, "We are not identical to our bodies. Our experience of ourselves is eccentric, divided from itself. We do not coincide with ourselves. So there is no firm or perfectly grounded way of being that we can achieve or that we can return to once and for all, no matter how appealing this might seem. And I think performance studies and actually environmentalism and ecology are both guilty of being seduced by this promise. There is a sense of disconnection from ourselves, from each other, or from the earth. So there is a desire to return to a true lived reality, an absolute present experience. But it seems to me, though, that there is never a perfect embodiment or being, only a kind of faltering, a consciousness that's falling in the gaps between physical reality and imagined realms. So performance then becomes ecological, not in its call to find an ultimate clarity, a stable and absolute presence, whether it be the earth or a solution to the climate crisis, but I think ecological performance works when it opens to this very groundlessness, when it rediscovers this faltering, fragile, multiple moment. And though I haven't seen David's work, I get the sense that it is the kind of performance that honors this groundlessness, that constructs situations that enable us to navigate this faltering quality of experience itself. Mm-hmm. Okay, last page, I think we're okay. So the third and last part is about withholding. So we've had darkness, groundlessness, and withholding. Yeah, I'm thinking of ecology and performance. They seem like very different scales, the planet and the theatre. Very different scales. So how do we connect them, if that's the right word? How do we connect the planet to this room, this moment? Until a few years ago, I think as a white Westerner, environmental catastrophe was a kind of imminent threat, but somehow looming vast and incomprehensible, a little in the distance, something that we could discuss whether to believe or not. But I think it's shifting, I would say, in the last 4 or 5 years, maybe with the pandemic as well. I think for a European ecological collapse, the Anthropocene, all of that, it feels like it's here. It's tangible. It's no longer intangible. It's no longer a hyper-object, we could say. We can feel it in our bones as European cities experience the warmest October, the warmest November. I think there are 16 degrees predicted for tomorrow, late November. So I think the link between our everyday reality and the Anthropocene is becoming really clear. But still it seems maybe strange how can we link this planetary scale and the smaller scale of the theatre. And David's work, I think, does it through the question of agency. What is it that how we impact our capacity to affect each other or the space or an artwork. The agency of the human being on the planet through capitalist extraction and pollution, and the agency of the spectator. These things are basically are kind of the same. It's the same agency that we're talking about. In David's thesis, he advances the idea that care, responsibility, as well as possible failure and some forms of conflict arise during particular dramaturgical setups in which audience members are tasked to negotiate their own presence at the theatre and to perform certain types of behavior which are often linked to a sort of withdrawal or a relinquishing of certain normative conventions. For example, being silent and quiet, as we will see later on in the Gardens of Sleep, being silent and quiet so as to allow others to drift to sleep. So there's a kind of withholding that's being asked of us there, not a sort of participatory spectatorship, but a kind of purposeful withholding, a drawing back. I'm struck by what David calls anti-participation. In the case of the piece The Guardians of Sleep, for example, it's the opposite of what DJs call let's make some noise. Here it's let's make some silence. Silence, not as an absence of something, but as a sort of activity, a doing, a performance, something to hold together, something that cannot really be held, because we cannot, of course, be silent, since by being here, our presence makes sound. By being here, we impact each other. It's inevitable. And still the aim is to withhold, to try and remain silent, to sit in silence or in darkness. It's striking to me because when we think of the activation of the spectator, a theme that is dear to all avant-gardes in different ways, David's work is asking us in a way to actively be passive. To really be an audience, a spectator, is to fully inhabit modes of attention close to contemplation, even a certain kind of abstinence. To observe our inevitable impact on a space, on each other, to wonder at the fact of being here. It is, of course, impossible to nullify one's presence, but in the practice of trying to do so, a different kind of space is created and maintained, perhaps. There is this recovering of a poetic, the outside that the Anthropocene declares to have disappeared. But I don't think this outside is something, it's not a return. We can recover it, but we can't really return to it. There is no longer a solid ground to return to, and there is no longer new ground to discover. Europeans know this, or should know this, better than anyone else. The wish for new territories to discover is a violence. So perhaps we have to relearn and practice withholding. We have to learn and practice withholding. It's a kind of practical mysticism, if you will. Sleep and not disturbing sleep, sitting in darkness. These are, by typical theatre standards, non-events. And like Ben Lerner's fading cinema lights, there is this clearing that happens. Temporarily and uncertainly, we recover the outside. We practice this possible, impossible. Here we go. So, yeah, Nela, the transition, the magical transition that we rehearsed so well isn't happening. You should have seen us in rehearsal. It was like, yeah, I'm pressing the white thing, but oh yeah, sure. Yeah, let's try and do it. Yeah, if you don't mind, we decided to do a choreography of technical arrangement. Wow. Thank you, Nela. It won't take long. This is called The Mystery of the Traveling Aces. I know. It starts very simply. Yeah. Or it could also be like this. It's strange because on the one hand, what's happening here is sleight of hand, I guess. It's a trick. But there is a small part of this that isn't a trick. Yeah. So here we go. It all happens here. That's the end of my bit. Yeah, I don't know how we're doing with for time. If there are questions, we can do that, and if not, we can sort of pause and walk somewhere, go somewhere brighter. Oh yeah, there's a hand here.
You talk about the anti-participation.
Yes.
I'm curious to ask you, because now you actually do the magic. What is the relation between this anti-participation and the effect of magic that you do?
Oh no. Yeah, that's a very good question. I guess in the talk, the idea of anti-participation, which is a term I took from David's work, struck me as being really interesting because, well, for example, in the UK, there is, in the last 20 years, this idea that to make theatre exciting or politically relevant or important, the only way of doing it is to involve the spectator. And so typically the spectator is asked to become an active participant, not just a passive observer. And what's really interesting to me is that actually the act of observing, contemplating, and for example, withdrawing your response, trying to be as quiet as possible, sitting in the dark, all these are actually the really interesting things to me. They're actually very, very active. So often when we talk about participation, we're disregarding so much about the human experience, I think. I think also by being a silent spectator, we can have critical distance, and so we have a sense of agency and criticality precisely by being able to observe and to not be asked to participate. In terms of how it links to this, I'm not entirely sure. This is what David was saying at the start. So I'm thinking at the moment for my own practice, how magic tricks typically are, well, they're a deception, it's a trick, and we sort of know that. And it doesn't really connect to things like, let's say, the mystical, or it's clear it's just a trick, it's entertainment, it's just, you know. And I'm trying to kind of understand how, in the history of magic, like, how did we come up with this idea that what happens here is just entertainment? Is there a sense in which the performance of magic can open up to, well, for example, in some non-Western cultures, it's clear that a shamanic practice is connecting to the dead, is connecting to other realms of consciousness. And in the Western conception of magic, we've kind of gone, no, not at all. It's a deeply secular, sort of secular undertaking. I'm very curious as to how we can, in a sense, decolonize magic and sort of actually allow it a degree of the mystical. How it relates to anti-participation, I'm not sure yet. I'd have to think about that a bit more. But that's why I brought this in today, anyway, to sort of think about magic. Yeah, I don't know if there are other questions or... If not, I can take off my Britney Spears and hand over to you, David.